What would you say if we asked you whether people in the Middle Ages believed the Earth was round? Most likely, you'd answer that under the influence of the Church, people thought the planet was flat. You might recall that because of this, Columbus set out for Asia but stumbled into America, and that anyone who disagreed, like Galileo, was burned at the stake. You can't really be blamed for such an answer. It's the version repeated in mainstream media and even sometimes in schools. But the truth is, these stories have nothing to do with reality. In fact, the Catholic Church always recognized the Earth as round. The real debate was about something else entirely, whether the sun revolved around the Earth, or the Earth revolved around the sun. And this is just one of many historical distortions and misconceptions that persist even in the modern world. In the next few minutes, we'll explore some of them. We'll ask, were our ancestors really short and primitive? Why did Columbus compare Earth to a pear? And is milk really the driving force of evolution? Spoiler, it's going to be fascinating. But let's start with the flat Earth. Ask 5 people who discovered that our planet is spherical, and most will throw out names like Galileo, Copernicus, or even Columbus. And all of this comes from the myth that just 500 years ago, everyone thought Earth was flat. That's actually an insult to our ancestors. Even the earliest philosophical texts, whether Greek or Indian, contain no mention of a flat Earth. The Indians, for example, imagined the world resting on a turtle, but they wrapped the turtle with a snake, giving the whole structure a spherical form. Only one ancient Greek thinker, Democritus, suggested a flat Earth, but his theory never dominated. Another Greek, Anaximander, offered the idea of Earth as a cylinder, which gained more popularity. But by the 5th century BC, Aristotle had shattered both of these views using nothing but simple logic. He looked at the moon and realized that the Earth's shadow during an eclipse could only be explained if our planet were spherical. Sailors offered further proof. First they would see a ship's mast on the horizon, and only later the hull. The position of the North Star also shifted depending on where you stood. Aristotle's reasoning was so convincing that his model lasted for centuries, and the Catholic Church later embraced his ideas. Yes, Aristotle was mistaken in one detail. In his model, Earth stood still while the sun and stars revolved around it. And that's where Galileo entered the story. But even here, most of what we think we know is wrong. Galileo wasn't the first to argue for a heliocentric world, he was actually the third. Copernicus had already developed his heliocentric model in the 16th century, devoting much of his life to it. His system wasn't perfect, but it was groundbreaking. And contrary to myth, the Church never burned him. He died of natural causes, largely because he avoided making public confrontations. Another figure, Giordano Bruno, is often portrayed as Copernicus's disciple. But in reality, Bruno didn't see himself that way. And he wasn't much of a scientist at all. He was an aggressive preacher who borrowed Copernicus's theory to support his own religious speculations. That's why the Church condemned him, not primarily for astronomy. In fact, records from the Inquisition show that charges related to the Earth orbiting the Sun were among the least important against him. And when it comes to Galileo, the myths are even thicker. Contrary to popular belief, he was not burned at the stake, nor did he defiantly whisper "and yet it moves." He remained a believer, maintained respect for the Church, and lived out his life under house arrest after being forced to recant publicly. In short, the idea that medieval people thought Earth was flat is a complete myth, a distortion born centuries later. First, let's clear this up: Galileo was never burned. Second, he never uttered the famous phrase "and yet it moves." And third, Galileo was a believer. He didn't openly clash with the Church. In fact, he respected the court's authority and complied with its rulings. The harshest punishment the Inquisition imposed on him was to publicly renounce his views on heliocentrism. But here's the key: Galileo was never forbidden from continuing his research. The only restriction was on publishing. And so, right up until his death, he worked on refining the idea of Earth's motion. Returning to our original theme, the flat Earth. In the so-called Dark Ages, neither Galileo, nor the Church, nor scholars of the time believed in a flat planet. The real disputes were only about whether Earth orbited the Sun or the other way around. Which makes it even funnier that the myth of Columbus supposedly proving the Earth was round is still so widespread. According to the popular story, Columbus's journey to Asia failed because he thought the Earth was flat, and instead he stumbled upon America. That's pure fiction. In his writings, Columbus actually described the Earth as shaped like a pear. His arrival in the Americas was the result of a series of mistakes, miscalculating the distance to Asia, relying on outdated navigation data, and underestimating the size of the oceans. And here's another fun fact. Columbus never even set foot on the territory of what is today the United States. Even at the time of his death, he remained convinced he had reached Asia. The realization that this was in fact a new world only came in 1503, and not to Columbus, but to one of his fellow explorers, Amerigo Vespucci. That's why both North and South America bear his name, while Columbus got, well, just a few US states and a city. So why, then, do so many people believe that people in the Middle Ages thought the Earth was flat? The answer lies in the 19th century. Back then, it became fashionable to portray the medieval period as an age of superstition and ignorance. In 1828, Washington Irving published his novel A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, Indiana, which he was the first to claim that Columbus's main mission was to prove the Earth was round. The book was fiction, but it spread like wildfire. The final nail in the coffin came from Samuel Robotham, who published a so-called scientific work titled Zetetic Astronomy. In it, he described experiments that supposedly proved the Earth was flat, and to make his claims more convincing, he dragged in references to ancient thinkers. But as we've already shown, neither ancient philosophers nor the Church ever doubted the Earth's spherical shape. As you can see, the topic of the flat Earth already exposes a whole bundle of myths. But let's move on to the second theme we want to touch on in this video. Before we begin, imagine this. You've traveled back 100,000 years into the past and come face to face with an ancestor of modern humans. Close your eyes. What do you picture? Most likely, something ape-like, not very tall, hunched over, with a small head. After all, the famous March of Evolution image has been burned into our minds as an unquestionable truth. Humans steadily getting taller, our brains ever larger, our bodies more refined, until our distant ancestors look almost pitiful next to us. And of course, that's nonsense. At least when it comes to our relatively recent ancestors. With early Homo sapiens, evolution didn't work in a straight line but in spirals. Let's start with height. You've probably heard the theory that humans of the future will be giants, since the average height has risen dramatically over the last 150 years. And that part is true. In Russia, for example, the average height has gone up by about 10 centimeters in just a century. A similar trend can be seen in official British Army records. Over the same period, the average height of recruits increased by a double-digit number of centimeters. But drawing the conclusion that people in the past were dwarfs, and that in 200 years will be 3 meters tall, is a textbook case of jumping to conclusions. Because all you need to do is look back further into the past. Let's ask a simple question. Imagine two people. One is a modern human living at a computer and hunting for food at the supermarket. The other lives in a cave 40,000 years ago, surviving through gathering and hunting. From nature's perspective, whose physical characteristics are more important? The answer is obvious. And in this light, the archaeological data comes as no surprise. Based on excavations from across the world, researchers from an Australian university discovered that 40,000 years ago the average height of men was 183 centimeters. That's 8 centimeters taller than today's average of 175. As for physical strength, it's hardly worth mentioning. Ancient hunters would have swept up every gold medal at the modern Olympic Games. As evolution moved forward, the situation only got worse for us. The well-known paleontologist Alison McIntosh used laser scanning to study 7,000-year-old bones and compared them to those of Cambridge students who were professional runners. The results were almost identical. In other words, a modern person has to spend years in training just to reach the natural physical condition that was completely ordinary for our ancestors. So, what caused this physical decline? The answer lies in the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. About 10,000 years ago, our ancestors were still strong, but their average height had already dropped to just 162.5 centimeters. That massive decrease is easy to explain. Instead of daily physical challenges, people planted fields and waited for crops. But crops failed. Floods, droughts, pests. While even under the best conditions, the nutritional value of farmed food was nowhere near the royal diet of hunter-gatherers. Malnutrition became common, and as a result, human strength went into decline. Of course, the situation varied from region to region. In some places, giants still walked the earth, just as they had 40,000 years earlier, while other populations remained relatively short. But overall, the trend is hard to deny. In fact, dozens of studies have been written on how agriculture played a cruel joke on humanity. And it wasn't only about strength and endurance. More and more scientists argue that obesity, spinal problems, and other gifts of modern life are the direct result of bodies still wired for a hunting lifestyle, except the hunters stopped hunting. And so, our bodies remind us of it with aches, pains, and health issues. Our bodies continue to remind us of their limitations through recurring ailments. And right now, our brains are the smallest they've ever been in human history. Over the past 100,000 years, brain volume has actually shrunk. In school, we're often taught that the human brain steadily grew throughout evolution, which supposedly made us smarter, leading to the belief that our brains today are the largest they've ever been. But that's simply not true. Around 100,000 years ago, the average human brain volume was about 1,500 cubic centimeters. Today, it's closer to 1,350. Does this mean we've become less intelligent? Not at all. The reduction is partly explained by the fact that our bodies as a whole have become smaller. More importantly, the brain has become more efficient, so despite being smaller, we're actually more intelligent than our ancestors. A similar evolutionary pattern can be seen in our teeth. Human jaws and canine teeth have been shrinking for millennia. Wisdom teeth are now little more than evolutionary leftovers, yet many people still grow them, a kind of stubborn nod to our ancestors. At the same time, there is currently a trend of increasing human height, thanks to better hygiene, improved nutrition, and overall living conditions. But this growth trend is very recent, a tiny blip in the grand timeline of human evolution. In the bigger picture, we remain smaller and physically weaker than our ancient forebears. That's where we'll leave off for now. But history is full of similar topics, riddled with misconceptions, myths, and legends. For example, milk is often called the engine of evolution. In reality, it wasn't. Humans only learned to drink milk about 10,000 years ago. Before that, every single person on Earth was lactose intolerant. Even today, about 1 in 10 people can't digest milk properly. We'd love to dive deeper into these fascinating stories in future videos. If you'd like to hear more, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like. See you next time, friends.